Okay, so we're going to be looking at the embassy of Sir Thomas Roe, who was the first official English ambassador to the Mughal Empire, to India in general. Okay. So on September 1615, the embassy of Sir Thomas Roe arrived at the port of Surat. The career diplomat was the first official English ambassador to India, sent to the court of Emperor Jahangir by King James I. The English marked the arrival with due pageantry for their royal ambassador. The fleet of English ships, including the Dragon, the Peppercorn, the Lion, and the Expedition, fired rounds and flew their most splendid regalia as Roe's boat put off to shore. Walter Peyton, captain of the expedition, would report that this day our ships were all handsomely fitted with their waistcloths, ensigns, flags, pendants, and streamers. For the English, it was a momentous occasion, and they sought to mark it with command and respect. Yet for the Indians who were witnessing the arrival, the event was an altogether different affair. Roe lamented in his memoirs that at this name of an ambassador, they laughed one another, it becoming so ridiculous, so many having assumed that title and not performed the office. Roe may have been the first authentically official ambassador to the Mughal court, but several English traders had preceded him falsely, claiming the ambassadorial role, then failing to perform it, often with disgraceful results. This includes William Hawkins, who arrived in India in 1608 on the first East India Company fleet and posed as the official English ambassador at the court of Jahangir. Initially, he gained favor, earning the title of English Khan and even marrying a lady of the imperial harem. But Hawkins would then fall from grace following court intrigue and the blunder of appearing before the emperor with, quote, strong drink on his breath. He would be evicted from the Mughal court in November 1611. To the Indians, then, Sir Thomas Roe was merely one more in a line of impostors hailing from an obscure and distant island nation of little consequence to fumblingly seek favors in their wealthy lands. The indignity continued to beset the ambassador upon landing, as Surat officials first failed to show interest in receiving them, then repeatedly, even forcefully, sought to search through their belongings and persons. How meanly an ambassador was esteemed at my landing, Roe would complain. So that's Sir Thomas Roe, the unfortunate fellow. The arrival of Sir Thomas Roe to the Muslim empire of the Mughals underscores a number of crucial yet neglected elements of Britain's Islamic history. While a notion of British Islam of South Asian heritage is often framed as a more modern, particularly 20th century post-war development, Roe's arrival in Mughal India over 400 years ago indicates a history of engagement and exchange far longer than popularly admitted. Indeed, India has featured in the English imagination since the medieval period, particularly as a land of fabled and immeasurable wealth. Across the English literary canon, from the preeminent titles to more obscure works, India is found mentioned. In the Travels of Sir John Mandeville, published in the 14th century, the writer spends much time on India, reflecting on its diamonds and spices. Shakespeare's Henry VI comments on the Indian gemstones in his crown, while Bassanio in The Merchant of Venice comments on Antonia's trade in India. Samuel Purchas, in his popular 17th century work, Purchas His Pilgrimage, includes a woodcut image of Mughal Emperor Jahangir and his son, Crown Prince Khurram, complete in lavish attire and jewels. And there is the woodcut. So as you can see, on the right is Jahangir, on the left is Prince Khurram, who would go on to become Shah Jahan, and in the middle is, what he's describing as his woman slave. Now, Sir Thomas Roe had actually purchased a portrait of Jahangir while he was in India, so Purchas may well have drawn from that image to produce this, because it is quite similar to a lot of the Indian portraiture that you have from Jahangir's court. The 1498 establishment of a cheaper and safer route to India by the Portuguese traveller Vasco da Gama opened a direct trade for Western Europe, with the Portuguese the first and for a period leading beneficiaries. Such was the significance of this achievement for Western Europe that the voyage of Vasco da Gama would be composed by Luís Vaz de Caminhos into a Portuguese epic poem, Os Lusíadas, or the Lusiads, and would come to attain the station of Portugal's national epic. Other Europeans followed in the wake of the Portuguese, often violently opposed by the latter, who sought to protect their interests. These rivals included the English, as well as Dutch, French, and Italian traders. The Dutch and English would both seek entry in Indian trade in 1600, the year the English East India Company was established and incorporated. English Calendar of State Papers record the East India Company's petition to Queen Elizabeth I to, quote, set forth a voyage for the discovery of the trade of the East Indies, close quote, in September 1600, followed by the company's incorporation on 31st December 1600. King James I would continue the legacy of his predecessor, issuing further permits and protections to the East India Company during his reign, and appointing the first ambassador to the Mughal court in Sir Thomas Roe. While early modern Western European traveled to India for various reasons, ranging from the Portuguese missionary projects to even the touring purposes of the English traveller Thomas Roe, who is a particularly interesting person in history, the dominant purpose for travel in India in this period remained trade and the latter's lucrative markets. This would certainly be true for the majority of the English. While the Portuguese had both merchants and priests frequent Mughal courts, England's earliest entrance to the imperial presence, from Hawkins to Roe, would be of East India Company merchants. Indeed, Sir Thomas Roe was an East India Company merchant himself, with the additional role of official state ambassador, whose sole remit was the negotiation of Anglo trade in Indian realms. With travel, trade, and diplomacy came the necessary exchange of both material objects and peoples. From their inception, these early engagements allowed the development of an Islamic presence in Britain, as the English consumed Islamic merchandise and South Asian Muslims traveled to, settled, and even married in England. But crucially, these early encounters complicate a well-established perspective through which English relations with India and the Islamic world is understood. Britain's historic encounters with India are traditionally seen through a predominantly colonial lens, one in which England, including its earlier native traditions and peoples, and I use earlier advisedly because I believe England's native traditions is an evolving thing. Curry today is native, yes? So including its earlier native traditions and peoples is the colonial authority against the subordinated and subjugated India and all she contains. The historical proximity of British rule in India, the 1947 partition and British departure was less than 70 years ago, renders this a difficult perspective to discard while the British Raj remains fresh in living memory. And so this potent moment in history heavily colours perceptions of Anglo-Indian relations more broadly, and with it an understanding of British Islam of South Asian heritage. History is, however, longer and more complex than our often somewhat confined trajectories necessarily permit. Europe enjoys a lengthy tradition of intellectual and physical engagement with India, long before British colonialism was conceived of. These pre-Western colonial encounters display traits consistent with their historical and political contexts in which the balance of authority was often in Indian hands. In the early modern world, Mughal India was among the most wealthy and powerful empires of its time. Before it, England was a relatively poor, distant, and divided island, one that had neither ability nor aspiration for imperial authority over so superior an empire. In fact, in the early modern English imagination, notions of a British empire was often only a reference to the British Isles. In John Speed's The Theatre of the Great Empire of Great Britain, published in 1611, the empire laid out comprised the kingdoms of England, Scotland, Ireland, and the Isles adjoining. Essentially that. So this is the image that John Speed contained in his work for the British Empire, and it's pretty much just Britain. Now compared to that, and this map is actually available in Cambridge University, which is quite interesting. Compared to that, this was the Mughal Empire. It was vast. It was several times the size of England's little island. Through the dominant post-colonial perspective, Sir Thomas Roe is in numerous English accounts hailed as an exemplary figure who opened the doors for trade, diplomacy, and ultimately colonialism. The Encyclopaedia Britannica suggests that in his 4 years of duty there, he furthered the fortunes of the English East India Company, close quote, while the Hakluyt Society's prelude to Roe's memoirs places the ambassador's efforts as, quote, an event of high importance in the history both of England and India and a first step in the march towards empire. Close quote. Yet following a humiliating entrance at Surat, Roe would spend 4 difficult years in the Mughal realm, struggling to carve a space to negotiate trade, ultimately to return to England in 1619 without receiving the formal trading agreement that was the main purpose behind his mission. The backdating of Western imperialism to a moment in which such projects was far from practical is a deeply problematic perspective, yet a common one. Orientalist readings of the East have contributed to a Western intellectual tradition which has, in Edward Said's words, quote, created a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient, close quote. But the early modern period is a time before Said's model of Orientalism holds true, as it predates the advent of Western European imperialism in Islamic lands. The embassy of Sir Thomas Roe, far from confirming a British imperialist telos, is a stark illustrator of that alternative geopolitical reality. In such a context, Roe's reception upon arrival is somewhat unsurprising. An ambassador of a small and not comparably influential land in the wealthiest empire of the Islamic world, Roe's project was a challenge even in the absence of the poor performance of English traders who preceded him. The ambassador often struggled to command respect. English state papers report on, quote, Ambassador Roe's complaints of the insupportable oppressions, wrongs, extortions the English have suffered at Surat by the means of a cruel, griping governor, and oppressions to the English countenance by Sultan Khurram, the king's third son. Khurram was Sultan Khurram. Furthermore, the English embassy betrayed elements of incompetency and inadequacy that undercut their efforts. Roe neither spoke Mughal courtly tongues nor possessed a consistent translator, such that often his negotiations with the emperor would be translated and mediated by England's most virulent rivals in India, the Portuguese, who had arrived in India a century earlier and had learnt the Persian tongue. At Jahangir's court, Roe would struggle with Mughal courtly traditions and be unable to meet the requirements of customary gifts to be presented to the emperor when seeking an audience. The ambassador was provided with a single gift to offer the emperor, an English carriage. Yet upon receipt, Jahangir would proceed to reupholster the carriage to opulent Mughal standards, while humiliatingly questioning, quote, whether the King of England was a great king that sent a presents of so small value, close quote. Roe would comment, quote, here are nothing esteemed but of the very best sort, close quote, and would enviously list the rich gifts brought by the Persian ambassador, who was well beloved at the Mughal court, including 27 horses of Persia and Arabia, 7 camels laden with silk, 2 chests of Persian hangings, 40 muskets, and 5 clocks. And this was for just one visit. By contrast, Jahangir requested 1 English horse of Roe, which he was unable to provide. Roe would lament, I have not had the worth of an egg to make easy my desires, and the Persian gives daily and receives daily. The ambassador's struggles did not end there. Soon after arriving in India in September 1615, he fell dangerously ill in the changed climes, such that it was not before January 1616 that he was able to meet with the Emperor Jahangir. Indeed, sickness would debilitate much of his time in India, hindering his diplomatic efforts. His ill health could be attributed in part to his dogged refusal to dress appropriate to Indian monsoon climes, insisting instead of traditional English attire of sweltering multi-layered taffeta. The combination of failed diplomacy and struggled survival would cause Roe to describe his time in India as my banishment. Meanwhile, in trading in such an advanced empire, the English found they possessed little to entice the Mughals that the Indians required or could not produce for themselves. Of the few items of interest to Emperor Jahangir was English portraits, which Roe provided. Yet these too the emperor would take pride in getting replicated by his own skilled painters, with impressive results. Upon examining the replicas, Roe would admit to Jahangir, quote, I saw His Majesty need no picture from our country, close quote. Describing in his memoirs the paintings were so like that I was by candlelight troubled to discern which was which, I confess, beyond all expectation. And he was right. So, you've got King James here, and over there is an image from Jahangir's court, called Jahangir Preferring Sufi Sheikhs to Kings. And you can see the third person down is King James. And so this painting of King James is by John de Critz. So Thomas Roe actually provided a gift of a painting of King James to the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. So it's quite possible that it was won by Thomas de Critz because it looks quite similar, doesn't it? And this particular painting is by the Mughal court painter Bichitra. It is not without reason that Roe would describe his efforts in India as, quote, nothing but vexation and trouble, close quote. The ambassador's position in a line of failed ambassadors, coupled with relative geopolitical weakness of the state he represented and the political preeminence of the state he attended, did not serve his embassy's efforts well. The English were merely tolerated in Mughal India, treated with civility, yet regarded with a degree of indifference. The indifference to English commodities would force the English to purchase rather than trade for the Indian products they sought, such as spices, textiles, and indigo dye, with gold and silver bullion at great cost. To offset this loss, inter-Asian trade would be an increasing means to finance mercantile projects in India. This would include the English enterprise of trading in Persian horses that they purchased from the Persian Safavid Empire. So the Indians were rather fond of Persian horses, so the English would stop by Persia on the way to India, pick up horses, and then trade with those in India. Indian textiles would also attain a value in inter-Asian trade, so the Portuguese would purchase Gujarati cloth to trade in Indian spice islands. While the Mughals were not particularly interested in consuming English commodities, the English worked hard to secure Islamic commodities from Mughal India, which would then find themselves transported, established, and keenly consumed in Britain. Yet it was not just a material Islamic presence in the form of lucrative merchandise that found itself established in Britain from these early travels. Trade and diplomatic networks would enable the transportation of peoples too. British Muslims of South Asian heritage form the largest ethnic minority in modern Britain. While this presence experienced a boost in the 20th century, its earliest roots can be traced back to the early modern advent of direct maritime travel and trade with South Asia. Indians were to be found in Britain for as long as Britain conducted sea voyages in India, with Indians returning on these ships, often as sailors, but also as traders, artisans, servants, and beyond. Of the vastly diverse communities that made up India, it would often be those communities with a tradition of travel, such as the Muslims, who would be more willing to partake of the long voyage to Britain. Others, such as Hindu Brahmins, were less frequent travellers. The first recorded Indians in Britain can be traced back to at least 1600, the same year Queen Elizabeth I granted the East India Company its royal charter. In 1607, when it was announced that the East India Company would be sending its first ships to India, 4 Indian residents in England sought employment on them. Their names were recorded as Marcus the Indian, John Rodrigo the Indian, John Mendes the Indian, and John Taro the Indian. Not very Indian names. It is interesting to note that Indians would often adopt English names in Britain. Given the history of Western European conflict, particularly with the Muslims of the Ottoman Empire, attitudes to Muslims in Britain were mixed. While Islamic commodities were valued and readily consumed, Islamic peoples were often perceived as a very real heathen threat to Christendom. The Ottoman Empire was expanding into Europe, and this was a very contemporary reality for the English. This may account for those Indian Muslims who chose local names, perhaps to ease their path to acceptance. The flow of foreigners from the East Indian trade was such that in 1615, in a pamphlet entitled The Trade Increases, attributed to Robert Cale, the writer deplores how the English ships, quote, carried forth with Christians are brought home with heathens. Maritime trade was a dangerous affair, with many sailors often passing away on the journey. The first fleet of the East India Company ships arrived in India in 1608, with many seamen lost on the voyage, such that Indian seamen were hired for the return journey. This would be a reality for every expedition, where lost English sailors would undergo replenishment with Indian workers. Some among these Indian travellers to Britain would settle and even marry English wives. In 1614, East India Company records show 3 Indian men sought passage for themselves and their English wives on company ships to India. Similarly, English men in India would often marry Indian wives and father children, later to return with their new families to England. William Hawkins married a Christian Armenian member of Jahangir's household named Mariam, and would later take her back with him to England. Upon Hawkins's death, Mariam would go on to marry another English merchant, Gabriel Towerson. In this manner, trade facilitated not only a material and cultural exchange, but an engagement and exchange of peoples, a steady flow of Indians, many of them Muslim, and Britons between the countries. Indian seamen became a feature of British ports, including at London's East Docks. In the movement of these early South Asian sailors, traders, and others onto English shores lay the establishment of the initial vestiges of South Asian Islam in Britain. In a time before Britain gained a preeminent geopolitical status as an imperial authority, the allure of abundant Islamic wealth would draw the English to seek their fortunes in influential Muslim shores. While these early mercantile projects proved mixed in their success, they marked the encounters and exchange that would lay the foundations for our earliest history as British Muslims. England's trade in the Islamic world provoked a shift in the landscape at home, as Islamic products and peoples found a new home on British shores. This was very true for India, whose riches attracted English traders and travellers in a time long before the British Raj was conceived of. 4 centuries on, we are the continuing legacy of those exchanges. Thank you.